Welcome again to another exciting edition of the Southwest Climate Podcast.
Emergency MiniPod.
The MiniPod, yeah. This is going to be an abbreviated edition. And
I don't know if we know how to do that.
I want to apologize outright for saying on our last podcast before the monsoon that we'd try to speed up our frequency or increase our frequency, and that didn't happen, Mike. What happened?
You left town.
Yeah, we both
Actually,
left
I left
town.
town too. Yeah.
We couldn't jive our summer schedules, and we basically haven't done a podcast since the monsoon began June 15th, Mike?
Oh, yeah. Oh, boy. We'll have to revisit that with
sometime in July.
It did actually start sometime in July.
So we're also recording this from a small recorder because we lost our navigator, Ben, who's traveling.
Yes. So
apologies for perhaps the worst sound. And if it's better sound, I guess we don't need Ben.
Don't say.
Sorry, Ben.
There's going to be heavy editing on this. Don't worry.
But what we wanted to do is just kind of do a really briefish recap, get everybody up to speed. And then on our next pod, we'll do a more thorough version and deconstruction of the monsoon. So again, apologies for not being able to talk about the monsoon during the monsoon
yeah.
And our favorite time to talk about climate. It's been kind of a bummer.
But I think we're right at the climatological peak of the monsoon season. So we're at the top of the hill of the roller coaster.
Monsoon midpoint?
Monsoon midpoint. Yep. We're right there climatologically.
So,
which has not served me real well this summer so far.
If it's all downhill from here, Mike, how much further down do we actually go?
It's really true. How are you feeling about the monsoon?
I guess I should say that I was gone for 2 weeks, but not much happened.
I know. I was gone from right about the official monsoon start date based on the old dew point definition here in Tucson. I was gone right around 10th, 11th, 12th, and I was back right around the 20th. And I kept checking, and nothing happened.
Yeah, I guess I would say I was thinking about this. I would say that a late start and a weakish monsoon just sort of it has a positive feedback on me. It makes me less interested in it.
I know.
You know?
I felt that too. Yeah, I felt it slipping away.
Yeah, the excitement kind of diminished.
It did, but it. So I think as we'll recap on this kind of mini pod here is that it was late. I mean, the outlooks at the beginning of the month were pretty much right on, and
we called that in the question.
I wasn't buying it, and it clearly I should have bought it. It was late. And it has really struggled. It has really struggled to settle into both Arizona and New Mexico. And we're kind of in the thick of it right now, as thick as this monsoon's going to get. And I just keep coming back to, I think the last couple of years have just injected us with some unreasonable expectations for the monsoon.
Yeah, your recency bias.
It's so true.
Well, before we deconstruct what's happened, let me just do a little bit of an overview. Basically, there wasn't any rain during the latter half of June, so I'm going to present some picture of July. And for the most part, all of Arizona, with the exception of one or two areas, has been below average. If you look at the northern section of the northern half of Arizona, it's been in the bottom 10 percentile of July's. And then the southern half of Arizona has been, below the 33rd percentile. So that paints a fairly bleak picture in terms of precipitation. New Mexico has been a similar story, but really only for the western half of the state. And again, the northern areas, Four Corners areas, drier than the southern areas. So that's rain. And as one might expect, temperature is sort of anti-correlated.
Yeah, inversely correlated.
Yeah, I got that right.
Yeah.
I had to think about that.
It's an antimatter matter.
So when it's dry, it's warm. And it's been that way. And let me call up. So in terms of average temperature, much of New Mexico and I'd say half of Arizona has been in the top 10 percentile. And all of both states have been above average. Again, that reflects a lack of rain because, rain brings clouds, brings evaporative cooling, brings, quite frankly, cool sunsets and a whole bunch of other stuff that we like that just hasn't been there this year so far. So, Mike, how did we get here? How do we get to that picture of July?
Let me just throw in a couple of station reports just to give us a sense of some of the actual numbers of the departures that we're seeing or the anomalies. In Arizona, it's interesting. I'm pulling up the data. So this is total precip from June 15th through August 6th totals. Kit Peak is actually 4.5 inches below average for this time of year.
How much does it have?
It has 1.56 inches. Its largest one-day total is about 0.42.
So that's 25% of average?
Yeah, so that's pretty bleak. There's a station.
And that's a high elevation. That's where the
high
rain
elevation
should
station,
be.
right? Yeah, so it's a high elevation station. It's near Tucson, so it kind of points to Tucson struggling as well.
So can I pause there? Because
please.
That's interesting. Because normally, to me, that would say that there just hasn't been a lot of moisture around. Because if there is moisture around, and even if the other dynamics aren't in play, like there isn't the convective available potential energy, or the wind fields are such that it doesn't favor valley rain, the mountains still get rain.
Yeah, we've got a lot of work to do on our next podcast to pick this apart. So I think in the let me just give you a couple more stations. Yeah. We'll kind of come back to that point. Nogales is about 2.7 inches below average for the period. They've had just a little over 2 3/4 inches of precip so far. Flagstaff is about 2.5 inches below average. So we're seeing both southern parts of the state in pockets really struggling, and then northern parts of the state. Chino Valley up near Prescott has had about 1/2 inch rain at this particular station, and they're about 2 1/4 below average. And then if you flip it around and we look at the stations that are the wettest so far, so we were talking about this before we started, Ajo, of all places, low desert, which is, so it's like the geography of the pattern still isn't quite hanging together in my head. So Ajo, out in the southwest part of the state, is 2.9 inches above average. Had one day with 2 3/4 inches of rain.
That was it.
Yeah, so that put them
but
above.
Even without that rain,
yeah,
it still would have been above average.
It still would have been above average. That's right.
Through today is an inch.
Absolutely, yeah, and they've had almost 4 inches of rain. So we go back up to the northern part of the state, Kingman, which is up in the sort of the dry tier, but Kingman is 1/2 inch above average, with 1.53 inches at their airport in total.
These just must be rogue storms. Right?
They're rogue storms because Kingman had 1.21 inches in one day, right? And so we've seen this just kind of erupt across the Southwest. A lot of very kind of pulsy, pocketed storms. We've been seeing it across the Tucson Basin. So the airport, what's the airport at right now?
Tucson Airport?
Yep.
1.3.
1.3.
And at this point, it's usually at it's on average at 2.8.
So there are rain loggers about a mile away that have had 3.5 to 3 3/4 inches.
That's right. So if you zoom in on Tucson, the area that's fared better than all other areas has been sort of the southwest part near downtown.
Right.
Yeah, Tucson Mountains around that area. Whereas everyone else, for the most part, we're talking around an inch or slightly above or slightly below.
Yep. If I jump over to New Mexico real quick, Cloudcroft has a departure of 5 inches. They've had a total of 3.62 inches, so should be up over 8 for this time of the monsoon season. Roswell on the far east side is 3 inches below, so we're a little out of monsoon country, but they've had just shy of an inch. But Deming is about 3 inches below average at about 1/2 inch. And then if we flip it around and we look at some of the wetter places, Gila Hot Springs, which I think was my pick early on.
That's right, our monsoon fantasy, which we'll talk about on the next podcast.
Has picked up more rain later on. So they're at 1.4 inches above average. They've got about 5.3 inches total.
And that's in the higher elevations.
Higher elevations, yep. And then Clovis, New Mexico is about 1/2 inch above average at about 5 inches. So it's kind of a mess to sort of characterize this monsoon season. I think overall what we're seeing is the higher elevation stations are pulling away in general. Are seeing more precipitation, but the geography is still southeastern.
More precipitation than lower elevations, which is we would say that about every year.
See, yep. And then their percent of averages are slightly above the lower elevations. So in general, everybody's struggling. Higher elevations are getting some more of those mountain hugger storms. And
you mentioned at the beginning that this is the monsoon midpoint.
Yeah.
But with those numbers that you just read off, it would take a really epic second half to make up for those shortfalls.
That's right.
We're talking 5 inches in some places. Talking an inch and a half in Tucson. Yeah, I mean, I guess like on those values, maybe it's just a couple really intense storms can make up for that that otherwise wouldn't occur. So it's not out of the realm that, we get a nice 2-3 week pulse of monsoon activity. And quite frankly, we've been in conditions more favorable in the last 2 weeks. And there has been across the state, not here in Tucson. For those of you who are tuning in for Tucson, it's been basically missing Tucson, but across the state has seen many days. In fact, I think it's just one day out of the last 15 or 16 where across Arizona there was very little rain. Absolutely. All the other days there was widespread coverage, just not here.
That's right. It's so hard to wrap my mind around. It doesn't have this sort of easy, like, it's just not raining anywhere. There's this single cause that's sort of nuking this monsoon season. It's just kind of an anemic start. And unfortunately, that anemic start is now lingering into the midpoint where we're starting to now kind of be on the trailing end. So I think to that point, the places that should have seen frequent rainfall from early July on are going to have trouble catching up. The lower elevation stations that have really wonky historical distributions anyways, anything's possible. And so I think we're still going to continue to see those sort of pulsy thunderstorms, and some places will catch up, but that's because their distributions are just such a mess historically.
And I guess we should say that officially, according to a dew point definition, at least here in southern Arizona, the monsoon basically began July 13th.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There was some activity around the 7th and 8th, but the dew point wasn't at a certain level for 3 consecutive days.
Right. And that was a bit of a false start too, because we had sort of the monsoon moisture boundary kind of move into the area, a little bit of instability set up. The precipitable water was way up, about well over 1.5 inches at that point. It looked like a good onset, but then the westerlies kicked back in and scoured out of that moisture, and it dried out. And that dry out required another rebuilding of the monsoon ridge and then the precipitation coming back in, which really didn't, the climb back up, precipitable water, was, through June 15th. And we didn't really even see a sort of sustained levels at what we would have expected to see in mid-July until we got to the later part of the month and to this week, even right now.
It was kind of a surprising event, though. I remember reading from Mike Leuthold's blog where he said during the 7th and 8th, I think, that there was really high precipitable water. And it was surprising that we, at least in this area, we didn't sap any of that moisture and that it didn't rain. So
yeah, I mean,
we just didn't have other conditions set up.
I can't quite remember. We did pull some of the data from the sounding from that particular day, and it looked like the afternoon Cape on the highest precipitable water we had, and I think this is right around the 7th or 8th, was a little less than 400.
Oh, you're talking Cape.
I'm talking about actual Cape, which I can't quite remember so what's the Cape?
The units?
I think it's joules per kilogram.
It was of sufficient value, or was it not of sufficient value?
It wasn't. I mean, it was weak. I mean, and again, it's compared to last year. So this is the problem, is that I keep comparing this year to last year. If this would have been like the 3rd or 4th year of sort of average to below average, this wouldn't have stuck out at all. But I think the last couple of summers, I mean, just looking at the data from last year, we look across the entire Southwest, by August 7th, more than half, about 60% of the Southwest, including Arizona and New Mexico, was seeing average to above average precipitation. So that currently is at about 90% of the Arizona and New Mexico are seeing below average, less than 75% of average, right? Yeah. So that's just, it's a different qualitatively monsoon than it was last year.
I mean, we should point out we have had backloaded monsoons, second half monsoons.
We have, yep. It's the midpoint, right?
Yeah.
And we start to now transition into the whole dynamics of the monsoon season start to shift around too, right? So the whole progression of the monsoon ridge, its sort of northernmost extent climatologically coincides with the peak of the monsoon. And so climatologically, you now see the monsoon ridge retreat with every week as you go forward. So that means that eventually you start to see that.
And that's driven by the sun.
It is largely. And again, this is climatologically when you average all those years together. So it doesn't necessarily jive with every given year, but it's sort of that background forcing is there. The weather is going to actually come into play, which is why this year we had that the weather pattern of sort of the active jet stream seem to have messed with the subtropical ridge into early July. I'm not exactly sure why, but we've really seen the subtropical ridge struggle to set up.
And by that, not basically north of southern Arizona.
Yeah.
And
yep.
when it's in that position, we're under more favorable conditions for moisture advection into the region. And also we can get these easterly waves that pass and create the sort of atmospheric instability necessary. And for the most part, that ridge, while has been in favorable position, sometimes has been more often than not in a non-favorable position.
Yeah, it's continued to sink back over us. And in addition to those factors that you talked about, the sort of mid-level to upper-level temperatures get warm, and so that's going to reduce our convective potential. What we really need is that real big, strong ridge across the western U.S. with the highest heights north of us, and so we get into the sort of the cooler, wetter air swinging around with easterly waves on the southern part of that ridge, and it puts us in sort of that stagnant, deep, moist air mass that we can play with in the monsoon season, and we've really struggled to hold on to it. And unfortunately, the forecast for next week it looks pretty fallish.
So the 8 to 14 day forecast, which actually would take us kind of to we're talking the end of August.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, the next 8 to 14 days are kind of big.
The next 8 to 14 days, I know if it was like the 5-day forecast, which doesn't look that good either, but it puts us into prime time of moving us into sort of the transition period into the end of the month. Again, it's kind of the weather versus climate aspect of this. And so this is that kind of mashup where you're trying to use the models at their extreme extent of their predictability. And what they're seeing in that model range is a suppression of the monsoon ridge. So there's some model convergence at that 2-week period that the monsoon ridge is sagging south again, and it's going to put us in the upper level westerlies. So the whole monsoon air mass is really going to struggle to be sustained here in Arizona, New Mexico, and it's going to sink south again. The only upside that I can see to this whole pattern is that it's definitely more transition. And one of the long-term models, if you play with it out in fantasy hours, it's pretty much fantasy beyond day 5. But if you go out to the far reaches of it, you go out to like 10 to 14 days, which I like to hang out and just play with it and see what it is. It spins up a hurricane in the southern Gulf. I doubt that hurricane will be there later today when the model runs again. But it just kind of reminds you that this pattern...
it is the season.
Absolutely. And the East Pacific has been record quiet. In going into it with the May outlook from the Climate Prediction Center of an above average hurricane season in the East Pacific.
That's interesting too.
I still don't know what's going on.
And we should also point out, related to that the struggling monsoon isn't just a fringe monsoon struggle issue. That Mexico in the core of the monsoon region has also been a weak monsoon.
Yeah, Mike Lethal pointed out on Twitter that there's been reports of crop failures, and if you've watched the monsoon forecasts across all of Mexico and look at the accumulation of precipitation, it's really struggled. And Mike was actually pointing out that he thinks that's part of the reason that we've struggled is that you expect to see some of that moisture plume that's sort of building up the Sierra Madre to contribute to the northern extent of the monsoon, which is where we're at. And so if the whole thing is faltering, then we would expect to falter too.
So what would it take if we're now at a time in which the monsoon ridge sort of sags south? What would it take to pin it in a more favorable location for 3-4 more weeks?
It's probably upstream forcing the jet to give it a wave pattern that would help it sort of set up in a favorable way. It's certainly a rebuilding.
They have a machine for that?
Probably. Isn't that what weather modification is all about? Yeah, I know. And it's
like putting a rock
exactly
into a
right.
stream.
Right. It's a Rossby wave generator. It's not a loss, right? I think this is becoming emotional for me. I'm becoming just sort of pessimistic to seeing it sort of hang out. And this forecast is bleak.
The
8 to 14 days. So this puts us through August 21st. The forecast could be wrong. There's tropical storm interactions out at that time period that are certainly at play. We're still in the core of the monsoon season. So I think that's still sort of a positive aspect of it. I do think, though, that these factors with the late onset, the struggle over the last week of getting sort of widespread events, this forecast leading into it, it means that some parts of the state just may never catch up.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good bet, given how much below average there is.
Yeah. I think that's just something we're going to have to come back to when we talk again on the podcast, is to take a look at stuff. And, what does that actually mean? I think it's range conditions. There's still fires that are of a concern. Water that comes out of some of these summer storms in some of the locations hasn't been falling. So that's going to have ecosystem impacts. So.
Well, yeah, and it also would interact too, puts more pressure on winter precipitation as well in terms of drought and those kinds of impacts related to it. So we had that short-lived. I know we're having some chatter over some email today about reintroducing drought back into Arizona. So we couldn't let it slide for too long before we had to bring it back in. It's very disappointing. Well, there'd be a lot to talk about. I'm looking at the time here. We said we'd do a mini podcast. We're now at 25 minutes.
Oh my God.
A couple other things that I wanted to hit on is and maybe we can talk more about before, but is just thinking about what have been the missing ingredients, because there has been precipitable water around for the most part. There's been periods of convective available potential energy, CAPE, which that dynamic instability, but maybe not as much as other seasons. The wind profiles are always challenging. I mean, we had a few days here in Tucson, for example, where there were conditions ideal to our south, but the winds aloft were blowing from the south, and it just like anvils covered Tucson, suppressed heating. So again, it's always
something.
Yeah, it's always something. And again, it reminds you of how hard it is to get rain, and then you have rain one day, and that sort of puts a lid on the potential for the next day. There's sort of these built-in breaks, which is why, I mean, we say this every year, but it's worth restating, which is why that, just 1 in every 4 days on average has rain in the monsoon season.
I think that we start cheering for monsoons that are widespread and everybody's winning, but those are rare, right?
Somebody's going to lose.
Somebody's going to lose, and especially in these kinds of years, which are probably closer to normal than a lot of our statistics actually point at.
How do we quantify that?
Which part? I know. Well, I don't know. I mean, because we always come back to spatial maps, station data, but the monsoon is often ungauged in a lot of locations. And I was just even, we're looking at some of the rain log data across Tucson. I was in a precip event that dropped 2.5 inches in less than an hour last week that made the Pantano run in the middle of town. I mean, it was epic, but it was so small, and it was caught by a couple of rain loggers. It was even in between some of the flood control gauges, and you saw the pulse, and then the water was disappeared before it even made it out of town.
They'd be flagged by any quality control algorithm?
Sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, exactly.
That's too small.
That's right. It didn't have anywhere near the airport. So, and we should talk about too, there's our colleagues at Walnut Gulch just published a paper with the Walnut Gulch.
Long-term observe.
They're a long-term agricultural research site now, and their long-term monitoring network with rain gauges. They actually point out that you have to have that density of gauges to actually track changes. And they actually measured an increase in intensity in the monsoon over the last 4 years, which is one of the counter to what the other papers have been saying.
Right. But this is actually interesting, because this paper, as you mentioned, had much higher density. Whereas
absolutely.
The other ones potentially are missing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the stations we're using, and we're kind of like sampling around, and just the way we're pointing out here, where Ajo is winning, and it shouldn't by the way that we're thinking about the monsoon, because it's way out in the desert and away from mountains.
Right, but when you don't have that high spatial density and you just have a few stations, it's much harder to detect a trend, particularly in a very spotty kind of rainfall situation that we have in the monsoon.
Totally.
The other thing that maybe we can talk about next time, but it just seems to me that when there has been rain, it's been not very intense.
I agree with you too. And I don't have... I mean, again, this is where the monitoring network becomes a bit of a problem. But even looking at like events across Tucson the last couple of days, the precipitable water in the morning is good. It seems to mix out, and surface dew points drop in the afternoon. And then you get these kind of anemic storms. And we really haven't, except for, I just said there was that 2.5 inch storm the other day, which was a great sort of localized storm, but not very widespread. But yeah, the totals have not been epic,
Yeah,
like
so
we've seen in the last couple of years.
On that point, looking at your plots, Mike, at the Tucson airport, on average, they get for every rainfall, recorded rainfall, it's about 1/4 of an inch.
Yep.
This year, the 8 that they've had have averaged 1/15 of an inch.
That's interesting. That's good. Oh, I'm glad we put
Not
that in there.
Not a 15th of an inch, 0.15 of an inch.
Right.
I said that wrong.
Okay.
Still less. And then the final thing, man, we have a lot to cover, but the final thing is, and admittedly, I was gone for 2 weeks, so correct me if I'm wrong, but there hasn't been that nightfall rain.
Oh, interesting.
And that to me is a signal of, again, it's related to the position of the ridge because usually you have those inverted troughs that create that instability at night where you don't need the sun to generate that lift.
Yeah. So we have seen, again, I think now the way I'm kind of thinking about the monsoon is everything's off by 2 weeks. And we have seen that the last week.
Okay.
And it's completely in lockstep with ridge position, inverted troughs, and precipitable water in the background. And having widespread enough convection where you're actually starting to see sort of leftover mesoscale convective vortices and just sort of broad scale, moderate rain kind of drift up. And that happened 2, maybe 3 times last week.
Okay.
But it didn't really happen before that. And
yeah,
so
I was
it's just
gone.
sort of a new thing. And it may be very short-lived. If this indeed forecast verifies over the next 2 weeks and we're back into the westerlies, in the upper level westerlies, we're back into kind of a transition pattern, we ain't going to see that.
Okay. All right, we should wrap up. So one thing that we'll do our next podcast somewhere at the end of this month, maybe the beginning of September, is we want to revisit our Monsoon fantasy game that we were testing out because both Mike and I
think I won the first period, but it was such a sad win.
Yeah, Mike and I have picked stations and we're going to see who's fared better, who's picked right. Maybe we'll figure out how to make that game more dynamic next time.
I think that's true. It was a good first try.
By that time, let's say beginning of September, boy, we should know at that time what the state of the monsoon will more or less be like.
I think we're going to try, though, for a pod in the next couple of weeks, though, right?
Are we?
I think we are. I think we're going to try to do long form.
Okay, yeah, we can
Whatever.
do that.
Yeah.
Don't hold us to that.
That's the listen.
We'll try to do it sooner than later, and it's just a matter of when Ben gets back.
That's right. We'll need the editing help.
Yeah.
So.
All right, thanks everybody, and Mike, it was good to chat.
All right.
Looking forward to it.
Happy monsoon, Zach.
All right. I never pushed record.
Really?